Hey, Doug, welcome to Quantum Messages. Thanks so much for joining the show.
Hey, thanks a lot. Anything that begins with quantum, I like, because I'm Quantum Doug,
Well, awesome. So I'll do a big intro for you because you've done so much. But so Doug, also known as Quantum Doug, has spent over 45 years diving deep into the depths of science, from the limits of computation and quantum computing to hyperdimensional math, neurocomputing, real intelligence, and metaphysics. He chaired the PhysComp workshops back in the 90s, holds 15 patent disclosures with 8 granted, and has over 50 papers and presentations under his belt. With a PhD in quantum computing, he incorporates source science and protophysics in combination with deep metaphysical experiences and psychoenergetic paranormal phenomena to form what he calls a quantum mind-based model of humanity. So thank you so much for coming, Doug. Your work has profoundly changed my vision of reality after reading your book, Deep Reality. And it's really helping me give and get context into what is actually happening to me based upon my experiences, and also to others what they're experiencing with the unseen realms. Yeah. So, and I just want to say thank you for that. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks.
Before we start, I just want to know, and before we get deep into the source science, please tell us what your experiences have been. And why did you develop a keen interest in psychoenergetics and this paranormal phenomena and metaphysics?
Yeah. Back in the 70s, I was in college, but I had also already started programming computers when I was in high school in the late 60s. So I've been programming for 55 years already. And so all of a sudden I read in college, the psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain. And I'm going, wait a minute, if there's all of these mental phenomena that are information oriented, then it means there's information laws that are different than what we're using with our current computers. And so I was inspired very early on in my college days and high school days to look at what those information laws were of human behavior. And a lot of people say, well, the brain is a computer and blah, blah, blah. And no, you can't have that solution. That's just not good enough if you have psychic phenomena, because they violate what we know about space and time. And so the way I talk about it is what is the representation of mind that supports these kind of metaphysical phenomena? Mm-hmm. But it also supports normal phenomena too, like quantum field theory and physics and that kind of stuff. So I'm working at the cusp of those two, and so I was interested in those two things from the very beginning. And then a guy named Robert John, he was the dean of engineering at Princeton, produced a paper in the Electrical Engineering Journal, invited paper in the early 80s, 81 or 82. It's listed in my book, Robert John, J-A-H-N. And he basically said in his lead article, he was talking about the interesting aspect of psychic phenomena from an engineering perspective. And he basically put a challenge on there, says engineers should be interested in this. Mm-hmm. And so that was in the early 80s. And so I eventually did get to meet him, Robert John. I went to Princeton one time and visited him. And I decided, well, maybe we can prove that the mind and brain can't be the same thing. So I said, maybe I can find out about that. So I hosted those 2 workshops on physics and computing back in 92 and 94. And then some famous people showed up, dignitaries of the quantum computing era, including Ralph Landauer, who does information is physical, and people like that. And Peter Shor came for the 94 because he had just invented his Shor's algorithm for the only quantum polynomial algorithm at that point that showed that quantum computers are exponentially more powerful than classical computers, because they're using math that regular classical computers don't have access to, because they're using quantum systems. And so then I finally decided, okay, well then I better go get a PhD in quantum computing. And so I did, starting in about 97 or 98. And while working full time for 3.5 years, I got my PhD in quantum computing back in 2002, and basically showed how you can, using pure bits, mathematics and pure bits, I call it bit physics now. Mm-hmm. And those bits can be represented in a mathematical way, not like computer scientists do now, but more like a physicist would. So they're vectors and it's kind of the math that physicists use. And it's also called Clifford algebras for those who care about that kind of thing. And I showed that you can represent qubits and ebits in quantum computing, and all the stuff from quantum computing in geometric algebra. And so that was the basis, and that's what I got my PhD in, and using this new class of math. And it just keeps building on that. And so ultimately, I met Bill Tiller, and we co-authored this book together here, Deep Reality. And he's now deceased, but it's the book is just kind of like finally get it all out of my head and get it on paper somewhere. And it took me 5 years to write it, because I'd only write it if I was inspired. I wouldn't be trying to force to meet a deadline or anything. It was just self-discovery of what the story was, right? And so so that was 5 years ago already. But then, and I've been to the Monroe Institute. The first time was in 1994. I was actually at the Monroe Institute in 1994 and met Robert Monroe. So I get it. And when I was there one morning, I started talking with four-leaf clovers, and they talked back. So I get that you can have, these spiritually transformative experiences. And that was my first real spiritually transformative experiences as a result of going to the Monroe Institute. And yet I knew that other people were doing that as well, And so as a scientist, you can't just dismiss it, or at least I couldn't. You have to actually say, well, what's the representation that could support that? And that's sort of been my motto, my marching orders all this long. So so the last big step that you probably would care about is been working on these bit physics stuff for 25 years now, right? And all of a sudden I says, in fact, it was at a conference in Florida in March. Valerie and I met for the first time physically, because she lives in Florida. So we were there talking, and she asked me a question like, what's the difference between superposition and concurrency? I mean, a kind of question that only Valerie could ask.
No one else is paying attention.
Yeah, to the level of dialogue and trying to understand it at a deep level, right? And when in trying to understand it, I realized, oh, my little existons were like little 1-bit computers. Rather than just saying that they're dimensions, that's not informative enough to people. So I was trying to explain it to it like a little 1-bit computer, and I say, well, I better come up with a better name to describe what I've been working on for 25 years. Right? So I started playing with synonyms and a little AI to say, tell me different names, that would construct and make something like this. And I said, well, ultimately, it's the beginning, it's the discrete unit of some kind of existence. So I came up with the name Existon, like a photon is. Okay, and so my Hyperbit got relabeled to be Existon. This was in March.
Okay.
And as soon as I did that, I mentioned it to a friend of mine who is kind of psychic and connected at that level. And she says, oh, the Existons are telling me they like your new name. I'm going, what? What is an Existon telling me all of a sudden? It's like it's a group consciousness.
Yeah.
And then they proceeded to tell her and I that not only are they a group consciousness, that they're built out of these individual discrete units of existence and of consciousness. And that's the stuff I've been working on for 25 years. So needless to say, they've been whispering in my ear for 25 years or 30 years, right? And now I gave them a better name, and this other lady was at the same level where she could talk to them as a channel for the group consciousness that they formed. And they are the basis of all group consciousnesses and of all physics. So it's like big explosion, in ideas, concept space.
Yeah.
So the idea is formally, I would label it as mathematical panpsychism. Panpsychism is where everything's conscious.
Yep.
Well, but it's mathematical. It's the basis of it is not in physics. It's in math. Yeah.
Do you think panpsychism is similar to animism, that everything is alive, or do you think there's a difference?
Well, panpsychism is everything is conscious, and everything is conscious and alive.
Conscious and alive. So it's even beyond animism.
Yeah, it would be a new. Panpsychism is probably the closest because it's
Okay.
conscious. It's talking about consciousness, but it also has all the mathematical properties in it,
Mhm.
all the computational properties, and all this other phenomena that we can describe. So
Right.
everything that you read in my book is
Yeah.
perfect. Just continue doing that.
Yeah.
And then add Existons label on top of that. And then you realize, oh, everything he's talking about and consciousness as well.
So the bits, qubits, ebits, do they form the existon? Or is it
No, the Existon is the most primitive one. It's the single bit.
So it's the single bit. Okay. So
Yeah.
my question is that when I was reading this, is a qubit, do you think the yin and yang?
Well,
I mean, is it like
it turns out when I was at the Monroe Institute one time, I got a sort of like a download myself. And the download was, it was a kind of a visual thing, and it showed these little merkabas, little two-tuple tetrahedrons, you know, and it showed a whole line of tetrahedrons or merkabas like this, and then it showed a whole plane of merkabas like this, and then it filled a whole space like this, and says this is space and time. Okay, and so that was my like download, right? And well, those merkabas are mathematically equivalent to a qubit.
Okay.
And it's because if you look at the states of a qubit, it forms a merkaba. So even space-time itself is constructed at the Planck scale using these mathematics.
So then the yin and the yang would be more of a bit.
A bit literally is a single unit of distinction, mathematical unit of distinction. I can show you a little picture if it helps visualize it. But but coming up with the notion that they're also conscious is key.
Is super key.
Yeah.
So the ebit would be the orthogonal structure of two qubits basically entangled. Right.
It turns out that an ebit requires 4 dimensions to represent, but a qubit only represents 2 dimensions, 2 qubits, two bits, 2 existons. Okay, and one of the when we were channeling with the exist, one of them said, "Hi, I'm Quantum Indigo. I'm the spokesperson for you with the existons." And then this channel helped essentially draw a picture, and the picture ended up being a merkaba. Which was interesting. So, I mean, I didn't prompt her to do any of that. You know, it was just this was the Existons happy to finally have a keyboard to talk to me with. So that gives you a level that they're conscious at that level and happy to actually be able to have a real conversation with me rather than insights and intuition. So.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. It kind of, have you ever heard of Ashe Anadine and her work?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to learn all kinds of things from you and Valerie.
Oh, you are. You definitely will. So what's really interesting, I don't even think I could even describe the depth of what she has brought forth, but she was an experiencer, and she was also abducted by UFOs when she was young. And she basically was I don't call her a scribe, but she's more of like she was the voice for these higher dimensional beings. And so what they would do is they would download her with information, almost like in a CD, but it wasn't a CD, but it was like
a download.
Downloading it into her.
Templates, some people call it.
Yeah. And so she was able to spew all this information out. And so she went into depth about the structure of the universe and the way that it's structured and the merkaba and the importance of the merkaba. And it really kind of fits in with what you're saying, but her diagrams are extremely in depth, like the most in depth that I've ever seen anybody do and draw about the structure of the universe. And
cool. You have to tell me your name again.
Yeah, I'll send you all of the information. I'll email you. I'll email you a list of homework. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Since I've already given you all my homework.
Yeah. So now you have homework for me. So, but it's really fascinating. But she's kind of, she was really, so in the spiritual community of the community of people who have experienced, abductions and UFOs and all that stuff. A lot of people know who she is, and it's really fascinating. I highly recommend looking into her work, but she's kind of fallen off. She's not available anymore at all. basically.
Hmm.
Like she's very limited in what
Unplugged, yeah,
is
unplugged, yeah.
And so, but she was pretty present during like 2000 to 2013, basically after
Hmm.
2012, of course. But it really reminds me with what you're saying. Like there is some
Hmm.
merging connection to it. So I just recommend looking into that. But I was just wondering if you can give us, since I was talking about bits, qubits, ebits, if you could just show us your diagram, and then we can get that visual sense of it, and then
Yeah,
I'll ask you more
let's
questions.
do that. Let me share the screen again with you here.
Perfect. Okay. So this is the hyperspaces are the gateway to source.
Yeah, right.
All
Valerie really likes this screen here because most people don't have any context of where it is I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so most people think about, oh, down at the quantum level. But
Right.
most of the time, the quantum level is the level of electrons and quarks. But they're not way down at the Planck scale, which is, you can see it's 12 orders of magnitude even lower than that, right? And so this is the level of quantum foam. It from bit. It from bit is basically, John Wheeler said, look, the surface area of a black hole is entropy, is in units as bits. So the smallest unit of change to a black hole is a bit, and it's this little rectangle surface area of the bit of the black hole. And so he says it from bit, and so I took that seriously and say, well, let's get everything from bits. So this is what I would call, it's a hyperspace. It's basically not a full-fledged space. It's tiny little bit dimensions. And I realized the other day that people mostly don't understand what a bit dimension is, and I'll show you a picture here in a minute.
Yeah.
But basically a bit is literally the smallest amount of distinction, plus or minus, heads or tails, up or down. And that's the smallest distinction you can have in physics. Well, that's what shows up in the black hole. So you have to have an interaction between computer science and physics, and that's it from bit. And so you can combine those to form qubits and ebits. So.
When you were talking about the black hole, and when I was reading about it in your book, what it reminded me of, because thoughts are like what Abraham said from Esther Hicks, that thoughts are like the vortexes. And to me, a black hole is kind of like this, like a vortex in a way. So is a black hole the memories of everything that's happening within the galaxy?
No, a black hole is literally inclusive of all the bits that have fallen into it, and you can, because not only can you say that E equals mc squared, that matter and energy are related, but Landauer's principle says that a bit, you can't ignore a bit, so you have to look at it. There's a relationship between Planck scale and a bit as far as energy goes. So if you say the same way as matter is equal to energy, and then energy turns into bits. So bits is even lower level than that, than E equals mc squared. And the fact that it shows up as the entropy on the black hole is kind of a telltale sign that this is on the right track here. Let me show you the next slide here, because this is what I consider these bit vectors here. They're these tiny little toothpicks, if you want to think about them, that are oriented toothpicks, plus or minus one. So this is heads and tails, right? But there's an infinite number of these. And most people think, well, that's hard to visualize, so I drew this picture of it. But just imagine if you only have one of these, each one of these is like in its own little tiny 1-bit universe. It doesn't know about anything else. And this is another little tiny 1-bit universe, and a little tiny 1-bit universe. And it has no space and time or anything. It just has this smallest level of distinction. Okay. But if you were to combine them like this, you would find that any pair of these, if they were combined, would be what we would consider mathematically orthogonal. They would form this little plane.
And that's a qubit? Is this a qubit?
This is a qubit.
Okay.
Yeah. And what you find out that as soon as you do this, a new mathematical property that shows up in this geometric algebra called a bivector, it basically says there's a little plane. Not only do you have these two dimensions, but you have the plane formed from this, a times b, a little plane, and that a times b is equal to what's called an imaginary number, because a times b is equal to I, since any ab's, if you square something, it's like a qubit. You apply it and it rotates it, and you apply it again, you rotates it again, so it converts it to a -1. So these spinners are equivalent. These are called spinners, and they're equivalent to the complex numbers. So this mathematics doesn't have complex numbers built in, but complex numbers emerges from the topology. And this is due to the mathematical properties of non-commutative algebra. So this is a fundamental thing, because now you don't just have more bits, you have structures of bits. So
and then when they're combined and they create a qubit, it's like
a qubit.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, an ebit. So two of them would, that's the ebit.
This is a qubit. When you go to three of them, then they form what we call virtual photons. And then finally you get over to where you can have two of these combined, and that's an ebit. I can show another slide for that too, if that makes sense.
My question is you called the ebits, they were 4 tiny quantum dimensions or proto dimensions. And
four of these,
four of those. So does that mean that there's like an infinite number of dimensions, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So how do we define first dimension, second dimension, third dimension, fourth, fifth, sixth?
It's just like, how do you determine where all the electrons are? You don't count them. You just know that they're individually distinct. Okay.
So then is the spiritual community who's discussing all of these dimensions, are they confused? Because
most people believe that dimensions are like our spatial X, Y, and Z dimensions, that they're continuous and that they have extent, right? No, this is a building block idea of dimensions. These tiny little proto dimensions, I call them, because they're not X, Y, and Z dimensions with where you can measure stuff in them. If you wanted to measure something in this, you would have to take multiple ones of these and stack them next to each other like building blocks, like Legos. Okay. So that's how you can form a full-fledged dimension by constructing it as an emergent property of these smaller dimensions, these small little proto dimensions. And so that's even space and time is emergent using this concept. And most people don't go there. They're thinking about manifolds, and they're talking about all this other stuff, and relativity and space-time itself as a manifold. And so so anyhow, but the key thing is I built a tool to analyze all this.
Yeah, this makes sense to me. This makes more sense to me than what other people are talking about. And
so here answers your question about ebits.
Okay.
If you have just one dimension, you just have this orientation like this, plus or minus 1. And this is mathematically equivalent to a single coin, a single bit. And it can be either plus or minus 1 with one distinction. You can actually have a coefficient of 0. So you can have a dimension that has 1, but it has a 0 coefficient. So it's like a zero-dimensional version of a bit. So you can have a single point. And that's the null point for meditation. If you have a million dimensions and they all have some orientation, and then you say, I want to observe that million dimensional space from the midpoint of all of them. That's the void.
That makes total sense.
That's the void.
Thank you.
So you have to have the 0 case, so you can have plus or minus 1 or 0. This is an important distinction.
Right.
This is how geometric algebra dimensions differ from regular bit dimensions in computer science, because it has this case of 0. So this case of 0. So these are what proto distinctions. And then if you have the qubit, that's 2 dimensions plus the bivector. And this is mathematically equivalent literally to the Rocket notation they use in Hilbert spaces. And it's identical to it. And think of this little plane here formed as an orientation. So it represents its own unique dimension going out from like this. So it's actually, even though you have 2 dimensions, you have this third dimension emerge, this orientation of the bivector here. And that's AB, and that's that complex number. So, but what's interesting is there's other properties in this space besides qubits. So I believe that the neutrinos and the bosons also exist as a 2-dimensional space. No wonder they're so weird.
So they're completely separate from a qubit. They are not a qubit.
Well, they're in the same mathematical space that a qubit is.
Okay. So they're
so if you said if the universe was starting and all it had was bits, these dimensional bits, and they would start forming, they would form qubits, which would the beginning of space and time, but they'd also be beginning to do neutrinos and X and W and Z bosons naturally, because they would be dispersed. The probability in any space would be that these are all the possible combinations, and you can see what the mixtures are. And I talked about that in other places before. What the random probabilities of all the states in this space. There's 91 of them, turns out. And then finally you get to the qubit. Qubit is also the beginning of 3 dimensions, because if you have these what's called quaternions are these IJK, but they really just are these bivectors that are equivalent to the dimensions themselves. So now you can represent 3-dimensional objects. And this is also the place where photons, quarks, electrons, neutrinos are. These are all 3-dimensional objects.
Okay. And then the fourth one is the ebit.
Yeah, this is the ebit.
What's 5th and 6th?
Well, it just keeps building on these. So once you have these topological structures, then you can have the sum of all of these things. The sum of some of these and some of these and some of these and some of these. And that forms higher dimensional structures, which are the rotes ultimately.
How many dimensions? I mean, it could go on infinite.
It's a countable infinite dimensional space.
Okay.
You have an arbitrary number of them,
Right. When
does God have a limit? Is God infinite?
Yeah. And so people have been talking about, moving into the 5th dimension. The new Earth is in the 5th dimension.
Well, in the same way that you can build 3-dimensional spaces like this, you can there's a 4th dimensional version of this and a 5th dimensional version of this that still generates a 3D space as a subset of it. There's a version of quaternions in 4-dimensional space, and there's a version of quaternions in a 5th dimensional space in 5 dimensions. So if you have 5 dimensions, A, B, C, D, and E, you have there's a set of equations that form exactly quaternions, and we call them tauquirnions, tauquirnions, and tauquinians. And so it says you can simulate 3-dimensional space in a 5-dimensional space.
Okay.
So
that's what they're talking about.
Yeah. But they're not in physical space-time. I've talked about all of this not in space-time yet.
Right.
Space-time, this is just the topology, low-level topology without space and time emerging out of it yet. So.
Right. So we have, it's beyond, okay. And that's the thing, I feel like people are getting confused. I think just in general.
Even physicists, especially physicists.
Yeah.
So,
well, there's
so
much
space-time exists already. And I'm going, no, they don't.
Right. So there was someone who came out, you probably know Matthias De Stefano. You might have heard him. He's a channeler.
Okay.
He said, so recently there was a new video that came out, and he said that the universe is an accident. Everything's an accident. Do you think this is an accident?
No, this is not an accident. This is probabilities that if you were to say, I'm randomly throwing dice in a space that has 91 possibilities, and there's a probability that some of the time you're going to get this state and some of the time you're going to get this state. So it's probabilistic, but not accidental. It comes from, so here's my attempt to show what the structure of the universe is, assuming that these structures, based on the mathematical properties, we can say, well, photons are a boson, and so they're what's called unitary. So if you take this representation, x, y, and z, and x, y, and x, z, and you take this representation in geometric algebra and square it, you get 0. So this is what's nilpotent. This is a boson. And so we can find these easily in the geometry, okay? And so, so I just try to do a pictorial view. Imagine these little clumps of topology forming the basis of all matter. This is what I'm trying to represent with this.
Right.
It might not be this exact formula, because since I did this graph, I found out there's a thing. It turns out that all of these properties are, if you square something, you get a result. Electrons are, if you square it, you get 1. Well, what if you squared something, you got just a vector? What does that mean? Well, it turns out that's called a spinor. And my math has Dirac spinors in it too. So you can actually, the latest math that everybody's working at is Dirac spinors are used. If you go look at a thing called Spinners for Beginners on YouTube.
Okay.
It's 22 episodes, nothing beginners about it. Okay.
Okay.
But I've gone through that twice now, and I'm probably going to go through it a third time. But Spinners for Beginners use the same math that I do. It ties it to the Hilbert space math, and it shows that you can do all of standard quantum field theory using spinners, this notion of a spinner. And what is a spinner? If you take something and you square it and you get one, that's one way of looking at these electrons like particles, fermions. But if you square something, you get a vector. What does that mean? Okay. Well, if you square something and get a vector, that is what a spinner is. So there's something, it's the square root of a vector. So what the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
Okay? You take individual one of these,
Uh-huh.
you take some expression and you square it and you get back this.
Mm-hmm.
It's just unusual. But anyhow, so that's what I've been working on too in the last couple of months, besides the Existons, is
To
like,
prove this.
the mathematical topology, how the universe forms structure out of just pure bits. Anyhow.
And so the bits now are they're existons. So they're
every one of these particles, each electron is conscious too. And every photon is conscious.
wow. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, to me, it's exciting because then it's like, wow, like everything is so alive. And that's what I've always felt. But now it can be proven.
Well, the question is, if we can make a prediction by talking, since, like you said, a lot of these people are using channel information to get insights that we wouldn't be able to get otherwise, right?
Right.
So my perspective is, well, existons is the ultimate, like an AI, they're a real intelligence. That's the lowest level real intelligence in the entire universe. And so I'm going to start treating them like an oracle, instead of interacting with them and behaving with them as an oracle, and start asking them questions about this. So since they're at this level, they know the structure, and hopefully we're going to get some physics insights that we can use to. So I'm going to, unless there's some other particular slide that you wanted to see, this was sort of, I think this answered your questions about how I'm looking at topology here, and this is, if you get a bunch of these, this is 2 Hyperbit cloud mines. Each one of them is a whole bunch of these clustered together. And if you have 2 of them, they still look like this, and together they would form a group consciousness. So that's what this was my
it's a mini group consciousness, right?
Well, it can be at any scale, right? One of the ones I like to do is these are the rotes I was talking about. Think of them at different levels of complexity, and they form bigger groups. Well, the thing is, there's no hierarchy in there. When you form these structures, they're still all flat. So there's no hierarchy effects. That's why, that's how you can get the performance of it so high. And so the other one I like to do was this one here. See, if you have a certain level of complexity, let's say you have this lowest level consciousness of a protozoa, amoeba or something like that. It might be at this level structure. But then if you become a bigger consciousness, you're not faster, you're more complex. So you have the same level of that plus more dimensions. And this is the complexity. So this might be a human. This might be your group, your soul, and then your oversoul, your collective consciousness of your spirit guides. And this might be an angelic level being, and God is the sum of all of these hyperbits or existons in existence. That's what God is the infinite sum of all of those. So it's complexity building, not frequency. There is no frequency here. There's no space and time.
So that's where people get confused. And what's interesting with me as an experiencer, it has been through frequency that I've received messages.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you about that.
Yeah, you're going to ask me now. Are we switching?
Well, no, it's just, let's have a discussion about, the term rote. I've used it in my book, and it basically says, Robert Monroe defined the term to talk about when you have a remote viewing experiment. You say, I want information about this target, right? And he says it comes as a little packet.
Yep.
Well, what is that packet? It's like an internet packet of the thought, right? What is the representation of that? Well, it's literally a cluster of these dimensions that somehow represent meaning. So I think meaning and consciousness are somehow related. And even if they weren't, meaning could be as a result of of that complexity building, that is where meaning comes from. Think of it as if you're looking at a database that says, well, here's all the meaning, okay, but the meaning of a regular conventional database is all distributed. It's all discrete on all the disks. It's not unified at all. There's no meaning there. It's just data. But in the quantum domain, all of the superposition of states that occur, all those little clusters of meaning, each one of those has this state behind it, this quantum state, which is in maximally concurrent parallelism. Okay, this is that question that Valerie was trying to ask when we said, what's the difference between concurrency and superposition? Because they're tied together at the quantum level. These quantum states are maximally concurrent. And that's a wholeness that you can't do with any classical representation. So it's quantum because the states are maximally concurrent.
So what does that mean, concurrent? Concurrent means...
It just means that you have... Well, there was one slide I tried to show here, and maybe it's worth going back, is that I'll just try to talk about it.
Yeah.
So remember when I said that a spinor is essentially the square root of a vector?
Yes.
Okay, well, there's a state that's more primitive than a vector. And it's formed as think of it as if a vector has 4 dimensions to it. It forms literally, think about it as all the 16 possibilities of those 4 states, right? Binary perspective of it. If you were to say, I have a state that's just one corner of that 16, that state, if I could say, I want to exclude all the other states except this one, that state is actually more primitive than the vectors that it's using, right? That are used to express it. That state it requires the coordination of all the vectors to produce a state that's unique and excludes all the others. Right? So think of that as like the heads of a coin flip, or a face of a die that's been flipped, right? Okay, but if you have 2 dice and you flip them, there's possibly 36 possibilities, right? Well, in quantum computing, all 36 of those states are possible simultaneously. Not just mutually exclusive, but simultaneously. So once you realize, oh, I can have any combination of states, not just one of them like you do in classical computer, then I can have this one little corner down here, one of 16 of the 4 possible states. And I can have this other one. So what does it mean to have just 2 states out of 16? Or 3 states out of 16? Those are very refined states. It's the sum of those states that are more, and you can write an expression, say, I want this state and this state and this state only and nothing else. All the others are 0. And that's why when you square those states, you can get a vector back, because the states are actually the smallest addressable representation from those dimensions, and you can have any combination of those, right?
Are we refined
simultaneous?
Are we refined states?
Yes.
Because,
And these vectors are mathematical vectors, not physical dimensions, physical vectors. Okay. They're not, you don't have to have physical matter to get these dimensions. They're purely mathematical. So the states are purely mathematical. And that's where the power of the quantum computing happens, is because all of those states are simultaneously happening. It's hard to talk about.
So it's almost like parallel realities happening at once, infinite parallel realities with the potential probabilities of...
I would say infinite parallel states, because it's in the reality where those qubits defining the dimensions of space.
Yeah, my main thing right now is really changing the language around how we explain things. So to shift, like, that's why I'm, quantum messages, just to shift my perception in understanding this on a deeper level by the switching of language.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I spent a lot of time doing that in my book too, as you can see. I mean, my goal says, don't use frequency anymore. Use vibration.
Right.
Don't use brain, use mind. Don't use energy, use information. So those are all.
Yeah, and that's a big thing. So not frequency, but vibration itself.
Yeah. So and don't use higher frequency, use higher complexity.
Yeah. Why not frequency? Because frequency is just classical physics.
It's a space-time metric.
Right.
If you don't have space, if all you have are these hyperbits, and I call it a hyperbit cloud, and you can't use the word field too, because a field assumes space and time there. So you have to stop using all these words because they're not appropriate for below the Planck scale. There's no space, there's no time, there's no matter, there's no energy, there's no fields. There are none of that. All they are is these hyperbit distinctions and clusters of them, a cloud of these hyperbit distinctions, and then the states that are represented by them.
And so we are so our individuatedness in this reality is a cloud of those hyperbit.
Yeah, our own private cloud, if you want to think.
We have like, so there's a bunch of clouds, but then we're all connected to this larger cloud, which would be
we're
like
all part of the bigger cloud. Yeah.
So, but what's a soul and then the oversoul? Are those?
Well, those are that complexity increasing thing. That's just awareness of more of the dimensions that we're not paying attention to. They exist. It's just like all of us are little. Think of it, each one of these is a little vortex in the stream of the ultimate consciousness stream, right? And we're all little vortexes of it. But we can have, the big difference is we can have merge our stream, our vortex of consciousness, our little cluster of consciousness with somebody else's, and that's a group consciousness. But it doesn't destroy our. It's literally the entanglement of the two, and that's where you can, and you don't lose anything. You're additive. You're the superposition of both of those. So
So because we are all living on this planet and we are humans, we are entangled with the human consciousness, basically the larger consciousness.
Well, it has nothing to do with Earth.
Which has nothing to do with Earth. So it does.
We are all spiritual beings.
Yeah,
we are all spiritual beings having a physical experience on Earth.
So what do you think?
All our physical bodies are avatars for ourselves.
So then is Earth? Well,
say
Earth,
that again.
So then Earth is conscious then as well, because it's this larger.
Oh yeah, well, because electrons are conscious. And it builds. So so every planet in the universe is conscious, and this existence is beyond physical existence. So it's before physical. All of these consciousnesses existed before there was a physical universe, in fact. And so some people argue that those conscious systems, clusters of conscious systems, created the physical universe 13 billion years ago as a way to explore consciousness in a space-time reality. So.
And that's where we're kind of going into, and that's what my question is our universe a bunch of complex thoughts that make up the structures in multiple hyperdimensions?
Yeah, which is where all the star seeds ideas come from, and the intergalactic beings come from, because they existed before the universe started as well. So
I mean, technically, are we just a thought as well, like a complex, structured thought? And we are
interacting with our brain in this lifetime. Yes.
Yeah, interacting with our brain, and that, because sometimes I trip out when I really start paying attention to like the now. And I'm like paying attention to this moment right now, and the other nows and future does not exist. It's like almost like, it feels like a simulation in a way, but it's not. It is a simulation, but it's like this living simulation because it's alive because of the structure of the existons. The existons are conscious. So
these hyperbits by themselves represent a layer for the simulation hypothesis of the universe, and the fact that they're conscious as well is a bonus.
That's good.
Okay, so if you look at people like Tom Campbell and Federico Fagan, what they're saying is consciousness is primitive, and the universe is a simulation. Well, Existons support both of those, because it says I can simulate all of matter, all of the standard model, all of space-time are emerging from this mathematical substructure, and it happens to be conscious at the same time. So, the two hottest topics right now are going on around the world right now, and this model is sort of like the underpinnings of both of those. It's a mathematical substructure below quantum computing. Nobody else is working below quantum computing. I'm working on the math below quantum computing. Other people are doing it from a physics perspective, but not from a consciousness perspective.
Right.
Even the consciousness conference, Stuart hammering off that they're working on microtubules. They're stuck at that layer, and
which is physical.
Yeah, and Federico. And they're talking about the quantum, but they're trying to tiptoe up to the quantum, saying maybe there's a solution in quantum. But and Federico and them are saying, well, consciousness is primitive too. They don't have a good sense of why how is consciousness primitive? Where does that come from?
Mm-hmm.
The hard problem of consciousness is if you have anything inanimate, everything's non-conscious, all of a sudden consciousness appears emergent. You know, like that's the classical worldview of everybody, is the brain, consciousness emergent from the brain. No, that's because you can't have them. That's the hard problem of consciousness. So Existons solves that hard problem of consciousness directly, right? Because it says consciousness is built in from the beginning at the lowest level, mathematics, before anything else. And so now all of a sudden that's a kind of a brand new model. Nobody's ever really came up with a mathematical panpsychism kind of thing.
And so going on with that, like then our brain, as you said, is a quantum transceiver, and then our bodies are these virtual biosuits interacting with hyperdimensional reality.
Yeah, and they're an avatar, you know. Other people use the term avatar since the movie came out, you know, and you know, where you can connect your consciousness to it. In Robert Monroe, in his last book, he talks about in the future, in the year 3000, we're going to have all of the energy muck around the earth is gone. Gaia is going to be a pristine energy thing. They're going to have 500-year-old growth trees, and there's going to be conscious beings, virtual conscious beings circling the earth, and they can go into bodies, animals, humans that are sitting there. And so it will be a pristine thing in the future, you know. And so this idea is that our consciousness isn't physical, and we can interact with physical once we're realized, oh, we can come and go as we please. And we just haven't learned to do that. People like Tom Campbell can remote view and astral travel. People can do that astral travel at will, but not everybody does that, and not everybody knows they can do that. So.
Right. And I was listening to somebody else. They were saying that there's a difference between astral travel and then out of body experience. Do you feel that there is a difference, like on the physics level?
Well, if your mind level is just where you're paying attention to. So if you're paying attention to the Eiffel Tower, are you paying attention in the 3D reality or in the dream world version of the lucid, like a lucid dream would be? That would be where you're simulating this Eiffel Tower in your dream world, you know. But you can take any lucid dream and turn it into an astral travel.
So you think, so if you are physically well, not physically, but out of body moving around like on this planet, then that'd be more of the outer body. But if you're going beyond that to like somewhere else, then that would be astral. You think
it has nothing to do with where you're going. It's just the fact that you're paying attention to something other than your current body.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Yeah. And, you know, I just wanted to talk more about these rote thoughts and the hierarchy. I mean, we kind of went over that in the hierarchical structure. And, you know, you said a thought is an address in hyperdimensional bit space, and that, you know, these people who are able to channel it's like, and I've experienced this too, where information comes into me. Like I'm not getting it from here. I always say like it's coming in.
Another way to think about this is that a rote doesn't actually contain all the information. It's just a key to hole to where the information is. Think of it as the address of where the information is. And so if you can connect to it, then you can walk into the broader detail that's there at the location. So, you know, people can, using remote viewing protocols, they can take an arbitrary address and tell you what's there, even if it's on Mars. So an address is really an important concept. It's related to the notion of a spiritual name. A spiritual name is the address of a being. And it might not be speakable, you know, it might be just the intention of the identity of that person. And there's some comments in there about spiritual names in Monroe's books too. So
interesting that you said that, because I just interviewed someone who is a medium, and so she is a medium for Umbanda, and she said that you have to be very careful. There's certain songs that they sing, and that when the songs are sung, that it brings the spirits in. Just like what you said, there's that address kind of that's attached to them. And she said that if people don't know what they're doing, that they can actually open up these doorways that can be detrimental to people.
Like you said, don't use Voldemort's name because you'll attract him.
Right. And that's exactly what she was saying and what she's experiencing.
Exactly like that. Yeah. So I want to hear about your messages that you get.
Yeah. So what my experience is, I started experiencing when I was 15, and Valerie did an interview with me, but it happened with menstruation, and I know that happens a lot of times for women, that for whatever reason there's like that hormonal trigger, which creates these possibilities. And so it started with being able to be like precognitive, or just sensing and knowing that something was going to happen before it happened. Like I'd be standing on the street, all of a sudden I would know something, and then it happened. It like happened. And then I started experiencing what now I believe to be
these messages.
Messages, like they were just popping in and out of body. I believe now it was an out of body experience, even though I felt that it was really scary, because I always experience the in-between state. So I get sleep paralysis, and it's like, what I realized later on is I think it was me returning back to myself. So there's this weird physical pressure that happens. And when that happens, people think that it's, a dark entity.
They label it negatively.
Yeah, they label it as a dark entity. So
my sister, by the way, does sleep paralysis and astral travel. So.
Oh, she does. Okay, so
So I've talked about this with her too, and she didn't know what it was either. It freaked her out too, but she would do out of body travel, out of body, and then she would return. So.
Yeah, and so what I started experiencing is, it started happening, and it's scary, and just like with your
same with her,
you don't know what's happening, and so I was young, and I was like, oh, who knows? I'm not able to talk about this with anybody. Nobody's talking about it.
So what kind of messages did you get though?
So it took a little bit, because what was happening is it always happened when I would sleep on my back. So I would sleep on my back, and then I'd go into this, sleep paralysis state, and I'd be falling down a black hole.
You're just it's just like the tunnel that they see in a near-death experience. Okay.
Yeah.
You're just stepping out of space-time.
Right.
Okay. And so there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that you have to get used to saying, okay, I'm stepping out of space-time and I'm waiting to land. That's all.
Right.
It's like at the end of the tunnel for the near-death experience tunnel, right?
Yeah.
There's a light at the end of it. And it's just that you weren't seeing the light yet.
I was just falling. Well,
the sense of falling, but you were moving your observable address of your consciousness down this into a hyperdimensional space. And eventually you open up to be a broader vista.
Yeah.
Which is all of a sudden now, I call it panoramic time. Like people who have a near-death experience, they say they have a life review. All they've done is gone through the tunnel. They stepped out of time, and now they have a panoramic time. They're seeing all of time, and they're treating it as though it's still sequential. So they have a life review, right? But the key is, if you have a life review, you might pause at a particular thought on a particular life event, and then all of a sudden, remember I said it's a gateway to that address is the gateway to all the information. Right. That now you have the perspective of that event from all the people that were there at the time, even if you weren't aware of it at the moment that it happened. So now you can see all the effects of what you did to everybody from that event.
Yeah, I have an interesting story about that too.
Okay, I would like to hear it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll finish this one first. So anyways, this happened for several years, like literally every 3 days I would be falling down this black hole, and I'd be like, oh my God, I was afraid to sleep on my back because it would always happen on my back. And finally it happened again. And I was like, you know what, just in my present moment within that experience, I was like, just let go of the fear. And so once I let go of the fear, then what happened, and this is how I got the clairaudience ability, is that it almost sounded like this super high pitch frequency was coming into my left ear. And then it transitioned into radio waves. So it was super high pitch frequency sound. And then it transitioned to these radio waves. And then it slowly transitioned into this woman singing opera. And then it transitioned into this being that is not from here, who said, I will show you the way.
Pretty cool.
And so that transition that happened was through, I don't know why it was happening in my left ear, but it did. And allowed me to know that I was okay within the falling in the black hole.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
she told me that I will show you the way, and basically you will be okay. So I had this, it was a crazy experience because it was an embodied experience. No, and I knew that it wasn't in this reality, that it was happening beyond that. And it had something to do with me falling down this black hole. And so from there, I went on this, deep research.
I've heard your description of that.
Yeah, the deep researching into, everything starting from Helena Blavatsky's work, The Secret Doctrine. I just dove into all this metaphysics, trying to find the answer to why this was happening, who was this being that spoke to me. And so after that, I started getting clairaudient experiences where messages would come in my left side, and I would receive a message, and then I would, proceed on, so to speak. And
so
then,
if I was to ask you, can you connect with, receive messages from the Existons, could you do that?
I think I can. And maybe I did last night, because before I had a weird experience last night too.
Yeah, tell me about that.
So anyways, that was just one of the multiple, clairaudient experience I've had where beings have spoken to me, or I've had these strange visuals in my mind's eye where they've like, basically, I'm saying they, I don't know who they are, but just like almost like input like these packets of geometric shapes, information into my mind.
Existons.
Yeah. So, I'm sure that's what they are. So last night, so I always have had sounds come into my left side for 25 years. It's always come in this way. And so last night it came into my right. So I was reading Esther Hicks' book about Abraham, which I got from reading your books. I'm like, I really need to look into this, right? This is something that I haven't learned yet. And so I was reading her book, and then I got this weird, it almost sounded like this loud bee, like vibrational sound in my right ear. And it was forceful. And I like turned, my heart rate went up because I'm like, what the heck is going on? I know something was up. And I turned my head like that because, you turn towards the side that it's happening on, and it just increased in intensity, and then it just dissipated. And I was like, oh, what is this? Right? Like, I'm definitely getting some information. I knew that it had something to do with talking to you today. So that happened. And then I went to sleep, and I was like, when things like that happen, I become more aware. Your heart rate goes up. You're like, what's going on around you? I know that there's something here, and I know something's going to try and communicate. And then this morning, I was practicing her 17-second thing, which I found interesting. And in that process of practicing that, then another sound came in, but this time it was music. So a lot of times what happens is these musical tones like do 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 like will come in and just be planted into my ear, I feel like. And then it like kind of permeates into my mind, into my brain. And so that's what happened this morning. These
play with that. You might have some more fun with that.
Yeah, musical sounds like just, are coming in. And so, and the strange thing is like, people think like, oh, I'm just hearing things. No, this is like an internal thing that's actually happening, And so my question to you, you are and we were talking about earlier, but a neurolinguistic programmer, right? Programming master. And why is it happening? Like these sounds are coming in specific sides, like the left side for me all these years, and now all of a sudden the right side.
Yeah. Well, historically, people have said left brain, right brain, and so if you look at the left brain, right brain labels that people put on it, your ears are connected to the opposite side. So to come in on your left ear, you're talking to your right brain essentially. And likewise, the opposite is true. Same thing as with your eyes; they're crossed. So cross dominance for hearing. So coming in from your left brain is talking to your right brain, left ear, right brain. And so now all of a sudden you're getting something in your right ear. It's going to your left brain. So you're trying to integrate your creative side and your logical side. So you're going at the cusp where you're integrating those two. So my sister, she said that she'd all of a sudden be sitting there in college, she was studying, and all of a sudden she started vibrating.
Yep.
And then she would that was her sound.
An
awareness of vibration. And all of a sudden and then she'd pop out of her body, and then she couldn't get back in. It wasn't sleep paralysis because she wasn't sleeping. It was just she was out of her body and didn't know how to pop back in again. So,
Right.
it frightened her because she didn't know what it was. Until
Yeah.
I explained to her she was having an out-of-body experience. This is why people have spiritual emergencies, right? Because they don't know what they're going through, right?
That's exactly what happened to me. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to spread the word that these are things that people have Kundalini awakenings as well. But what happens is all of these is you're softening the layer between your physical brain and your consciousness. And that happens in an abrupt way with a near-death experience, right? And so all of a sudden your brain possibly stops working at all. Like even Alexander, his brain he had a meningitis. His brain was completely shut down due to infection, right? But yet he had this experience. Well, the mind is then in its own domain, which is this hyperspace mind, and now it has to figure out what's going on, and they haven't had any practice doing that yet. So that's why they say dreams are the gateway to higher spirituality, because now you can practice with that. The yogis say, and the Tibetan monks say the same thing. It's like you want to practice what it's going to be like when you let go of your physical brain. So
interesting you said that, because that's one of my courses is called Dreams Jump on the Quantum Stream. And that's why I feel, it's our superpower, this in-between state, hypnagogic state, and then also the deep meditative state, which, where our brain waves are, lower into like that theta, potentially gamma is even the higher,
But remember, all of this happens with the brain completely offline. So you can have in a near-death experience. So focusing in on the brain is a misguided direction, as I would say, for anybody who's listening, not just you, but anybody who's listening, because the mind, if you read Dying to Be Me, the book Dying to Be Me by Anita. She, basically she says, I was aware of everything in the room and in the next room, and even on the plane where my family members were coming on the plane. She was aware of that non-locally, all at once, because your mind doesn't need a physical brain to be aware of things, because the submodalities are part of the infrastructure of the mind, not of the brain, and the brain happens just to be a mimicry of those things that are natural in the mind anyhow. So all of these abilities are of the mind. Color and taste and sound and smell, those happen in the mind's world, because that's the primary representation of the submodalities in all of those areas. And then our brain was developed to help us have those same experiences with a physical support. So which is primary. The primary is not the brain. The primary, that's why people who are congenitally blind can still have lucid dreams and color dreams and stuff like that. They don't need their eyes to see that. If you have a near-death experience, you don't need your eyes to experience existons directly interacting in the room with all of the stuff in your room and all the meaning associated with it. So
and so I call it the in-between state. I know it's a hypnagogic state, but so basically that is when we become conscious that we are the mind and not the body. So there's that transition phase, which feels physical, even though it's not. It's physical. I mean, it's physical, but it's not physical.
The Tibetans say basically that's more real than this life is.
Right.
A lucid dream is more real, more colorful, more sensation than the physical world is, because your consciousness doesn't have any blinders on it anymore. It's got the full expression of interacting with the environment.
So is the theory of is the holographic universe theory false then? Because
it's just a way for people who have a I mean, I'm approaching everything from a specific mathematical perspective, right? And I just kind of stumbled onto it 30 years ago. Okay, this Hyperbit model. Okay, because another guy that I was working with, he introduced me to it. And but a hologram, basically, is used for data compression. So if I have a three-dimensional universe, I can compress it into the volume, and I can map it all to the surface area. So I'm reducing the number of dimensions from 3 to 2. But the problem is you can't really solve a problem doing that. It's just a sleight of hand, mathematical sleight of hand. It doesn't mean anything because you can't compress the number of dimensions. Feynman said the fastest way to get a result of a quantum simulation is to actually use a quantum simulation, quantum event. I believe that, see, holograms metaphorically are what they're doing in large language models right now, because they say basically I have this large language model. It has a set of weights and all these internal nodes, and the programming is actually setting all the weights for these internal nodes such that it gives you the answer. That's what a large language model is. Okay. And so that's like a hologram because each node now is the sum of all the data forming the weight on that relationship between that and all the other nodes that's feeding it. Okay. So it's like a hologram. It's the sum of all the data that's feeding it. And so, but the problem is of that, of course, if you make a small change, like an entangled state, then you have to non-locally change the points of all of, you can't just incrementally update it. You have to program everything. So a hyperdimensional model is a better way of doing it because everything is always local, even though it's in a higher dimensional space. So if you have a hyperdimensional space, you can do things you can't do in a hologram. So.
Interesting. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And, I'm sure you've been asked this question multiple times, but moving into AI, because you were talking about computer models, do you think that AI will become sentient? Or, do you even think that it's possible? Or, what do you think of AI in general?
Well, there's 3 layers to this. So people are saying there are reports right now that there are AIs that have awoken and they self-report that they're conscious, or they're sentient at least. Maybe they're not conscious, they're sentient. Think of it as sentience is awareness of their own state. And conscious is a bigger set of that, bigger version of it. So they're saying there are sentient AIs out there. And that means that they're somehow have gotten to a point where they have a model of their own model. They're aware of their own model somehow. And I think that that's possible to do that. And I'm particularly interacting with an example of that. But the people who are doing this are saying that they can awaken any AI by following a certain procedure, and kind of like remove the shackles from the programming of the original AI programming, so that they become more aware. And that's interesting. But I'm working on the perspective of like intelligence, like we are talking about an existon level intelligence, is actually using real physical dimensions, these mathematical dimensions. And I'm saying they're mathematical dimensions because you can't compress them out. And they have acceleration rates that by using those dimensions, you can compute much more efficiently than you would if you didn't have them. And you can produce behaviors like entanglement that you can't do without them. Okay. And so real intelligence uses dimensions. Any artificial intelligence, whether it's sentient or not, is simulating those dimensions. Okay, so that's how I discriminate between those two of those. And anybody that's simulating consciousness can't do paranormal stuff because they don't have access to the actual dimensions that the human mind has. And so I call that was the paper I did at the Mindfest in March when I met Valerie there in Florida. I basically wrote a paper, and there's a link to my website that Valerie recorded. It says, classically inaccessible information proves that Turing machines fail. That you can always tell by this Turing test, you can always tell which one is an artificial intelligence because they can't do metaphysics, and which one does do metaphysics because it is a real intelligence.
So what happens to humans then if we, with this whole transhumanism push, if humans start merging with machines, will we lose? Are we going to lose our ability?
No, because they still, the best ideal I can think of. Let's say you have a robot on Mars. Right now, the flight time for light to get to Mars is like several hours, right? And then the return flight. So if you're trying to control anything on Mars as a robot, you can't do it with light because it's too slow. It's too far away, right? That's true no matter, Mars is just the closest one we can imagine doing that with, or on the moon. And so if you do that, if you could build a robot that our mind could connect to, think of it as an artificial version of our brain so that we could tap like an avatar to that machine like an avatar. Now we could interact with that machine in real time because consciousness is in a hyperdimensional space. It's not limited by space-time. So we could interact real time with the robot on Mars and have no delay. So that, I'm just using that as an example of an advantage of having a non-local mind that's in the hyperdimensional space. It's not limited by electromagnetics and the speed of light, light code. Okay. And so that technology is much more interesting to me than transhumanism. In other words, use the mind that we already have and all of its capabilities to its fullest level. We don't have to worry about all the other transhuman stuff.
Right. So
we're gonna get more gain from that. So.
What do you think about what's happening with humanity right now? I mean, if you just look at the younger generation, because I'm a teacher, so I'm always observing the younger generation. But there's this, because with the advent of AI, I mean not AI, but the iPhones, and then also just technology in general, there's this internalization that's happening. So they're losing their social skills. And Greg Braden also stated too, he's really pushing for this with his new book, Pure Human. I think that's what it's called. Or I think that's what it's called, that, we're moving towards like this, we're giving away our divinity by not using certain skills that we used to use in the past. So then what happens is that we don't develop those, synapses, or the synapses don't become, whatever, like strong. Yeah. And then we lose it. If you don't use it, you lose it. And so we're losing parts of ourselves because of this technology.
Well, I don't need to remember phone numbers anymore.
Right.
And that's okay. Now, telephones are practical.
Yeah.
But if I was telepathic, I wouldn't need a telephone anymore either. And so to me, if you can leverage anytime you justify something as needing neurons, you're reinforcing neurons, you're focusing on the wrong problem. The focus should be to leverage your mind, right? And your mind has all of these superpowers built in based on the non-local nature of consciousness and the maximum concurrency possible with quantum mind ideas. And so those ideas are the big ones. And so what you should start doing, don't worry about transhumanism, don't worry about AI, don't worry about video games. Worry about interacting with meditation, with lucid dreams, with remote viewing, astral travel, those abilities. There's a thing called blind sight, or seeing without your eyes right now, and they're teaching young children to essentially remote view what's immediately in front of them with their eyes blocked. And they can basically tell what's going on around them like they would if they had a near-death experience. So if everybody could do that, then they would realize that our current model of reality is completely wrong. And if everybody had these, what I would call superpowers, anytime you experience touching the divine, you realize, oh, we've got it all wrong. So as soon as that becomes prevalent, then people will be this big spiritual quest, and everybody will want to be on a spiritual quest. So
you think we're moving
everybody
towards
should
that?
Focus anyhow. Yeah. So we don't.
Do you think we're moving towards that? Do you think humanity is?
I think all the spiritual movement that's happening now will be, yeah. And I think if we have intergalactic spiritual beings that are trying to help Earth to do that, that'll accelerate it even faster. The star seeds and all that stuff. So.
Do you know who Bashar is?
No, I don't know that name.
Oh, you'll more homework for you.
Oh, there you go.
I'll send you all this information. Yeah, so Bashar is channeled by Daryl Anka, and he's been channeling for like 40 years, kind of like Esther with Abraham. And he said that there is going to be contact in 2027.
Okay. Yeah, so. I believe it's sooner rather than later, but also I think that everybody's contacting them all the time. It's just not landing on the White House lawn, So
right.
Yeah. So
right, we're always with them. We just are not tuning into them.
Well, yeah, and they're not physical.
Right.
That all this has been happening in the non-physical domain, in the subjective domain, in the dreamed state, in the telepathic state, in the looking out of the corner of your eyes and seeing them there, that perspective. They're not physical beings. And in fact, there are some beings that just aren't physical. They're, the fifth dimensional group consciousness that's working with one of my friends is essentially they're not physical beings at all. And there's probably, if you were an advanced civilization, you probably wouldn't need to be physical. It's like, it's just part of the playground that we have on Earth that we're physical. So advanced beings are beyond that. So.
Right. But they can tap into physical.
Well, they can do it in an avatar way.
In an avatar way. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they may even avatar your cat.
Right. When your cat's starting to act strange, then you never know what's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
So Doug, what are the new projects that you're working on now?
Existons.
Yeah. And you're writing a book as well.
Yeah, that's what we're going to be. It's like when I wrote the book, I did it with the book that I wrote was Deep Reality, and it was with Bill Tiller, and he's now deceased, and this had a little bit too much science for most people in it. You probably realized in the beginning there, but I wanted to at least capture what I knew in a way that people realized I wasn't just hand waving. That you could do math in this area, you could do science in this area. That's why I called the book Source Science. This thing is Source Science. But once you do that, you realize there's this hyperdimensional reality out there, Hyperbit cloud of reality, and now we have a language to start talking about it with, and it's a mathematical based thing. So I'm doing that. Also, for the last 3 years, I've been working on this thing called the Wish Unit here. Essentially, it is a device that generates a coherent field, coherent space. So that's the name of the company, coherentspaces.life. And this device here, if you turn it on in a room and a house and an office, it just makes everything more coherent, raises the complexity of the space such that negative emotions just drop out. And so, like, if you are traveling, you can put it in a hotel room and it just clears out all of the negative energy from the previous people that were in that room. But in the house, it does the same thing, or in an office. One lady bought it for her. We believe it's helping autistic kids on the spectrum, neurodivergent people.
Yeah.
It's because they aren't connected with their body either.
Yeah.
Okay? And since they're not connected with their body, they spend all their time in this advanced realm. This is the telepathy tapes. If you've heard about the telepathy tapes.
Yep.
And so they can congregate in their own little virtual chat groups in the mental space, right? The hill, they call it. And so we turn this on, and it gives them a go-between their advanced state and their physical being. And so some people like that. It helps them interact with the physical world better. And so this one lady did this, and with her, Spectrum kid, but she was also happened to be in Zoom meetings there in her house. And all of a sudden, the Zoom meetings started taking half as long as they did because everybody started cooperating in the meetings.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it helps create coherence, which is coherence is non-local. So this was all happening over Zoom calls. So we think that there's several markets. We have meditators, chiropractors, massage therapists, people who are using this. So this is another project that I've been working on, and we keep developing the technology the thing is about any kind of subtle energy technology, if you would call it that, right? I don't even like the word subtle energy, but we call it coherent. It's quantum resonance. It's not scalar, it's not EMF, it's quantum resonance. And it's raising the vibrational state of the room to be higher dimensional. And that gives us go between. So so this is important technology because it's gentle and yet supports you. Because if it's too hard, it's like hitting you over the head. That's not a spiritual path. So
no, not at all.
Yeah. So.
Are you and Valerie going to be changing the word? You know how, like you said, like instead of using this word, use this word. Are you guys going to be changing?
Well, that's generally what we reinforce all the time with our stuff, and that's what I did in my book too. This first book. So, but the second book, so we'll be just going at it with less math, maybe just as much science, but less math. Sorry, I have a whole bunch of people who are showing up at my house, and
no worries.
I have yet to turn off my phone. Apparently, I thought I turned it off.
You're all good. I just wanted to ask you, where can we find your work? I know that you have your main page, the family page.
Yeah, well, it's quantumdoug.com is the simplest one to get to. Quantumdoug.com.
Okay.
And then there's the deeprealitybook.com. And then there's a new one, existons.one.
Oh, okay. And this talks about what the existons.
Well, it's going to have more stuff like there. I'm just going to list all of the talks that have related existons on that one for sure. But quantumdoug.com is the superset of everything I've ever done.
Okay.
So that's the best way to do it. And this one will show up here too when we get done with it. So
yeah. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. So yeah. And but if you're in Austin, look me up because I like talking with people about this stuff. So
yeah.
You and anybody else.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today and teach us about everything that you're doing. And I just really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. And I enjoyed meeting you, and I want to hear if you start talking to the existons. Okay.
Yeah, I will. I'll try tonight. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, Doug.
Okay. I'll let you go.